The night started like any other match. Fans packed into Audi Field, ready to watch their team, the Washington Spirit, take the pitch. The energy was high, the crowd buzzing. But then, something unexpected happened. The chants that erupted weren't about soccer at all. They weren't about players, rivalries, or goals. Instead, thousands of voices joined together in a single explosive demand. Free DC! At first, it was just a few scattered shouts. People in the stands turned their heads, wondering what was going on. But the chant spread quickly, sweeping across the stadium like wildfire. Within moments, every corner of Audi Field was roaring with the same words. The sound wasn't playful or half-hearted. It was angry, defiant, and impossible to ignore. This wasn't a simple protest. This was Washington, D.C., speaking directly to Donald Trump, a city tired of being treated like a pawn in his political games, a city tired of his attempts to strip away its autonomy, a city reminding him that while he may sit in the White House, the people of D.C. weren't going to bow down to him. Imagine being Trump, stepping off a plane, thinking you can spin your foreign trip as a victory, only to hear that back home people are literally chanting to be freed from you. That's not strength. That's not control. That's a regime cracking under its own weight. And what made the moment so powerful was its spontaneity. No politician told them to chant. No organized protest group planted the idea. It came from ordinary people in the stands, teachers, students, parents, workers, all fed up and united in one message. That raw, unfiltered energy said more than any political ad or press conference ever could. To make matters worse for Trump, this wasn't happening in some small corner of the country. This was Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, the place that's supposed to symbolize his authority. The very city where he wanted to show control was the one chanting for his downfall. It was a brutal reminder that no amount of staged photo ops or spin could hide the truth. Trump was losing not only on the global stage, but also at home, in his own backyard. And the timing couldn't have been more devastating. Because while those chants were echoing through the stadium, Trump himself was somewhere above the clouds, flying back from a trip to Alaska that was supposed to show him as a strong statesman. Instead, it left him humiliated, mocked, and visibly weakened. The chants at Audi Field weren't just about local frustration. They were about the bigger picture, about Trump's collapsing image as a leader. The crowd was saying out loud what many Americans had been feeling in private, that his so-called strength was nothing more than a facade. But if Trump thought the chants were the worst of it, he was about to face something far more humiliating. Because his trip to Alaska, the one he thought would prove his dominance, had been a disaster from start to finish, and the images from that trip told a story that no amount of spin could cover up. Donald Trump wanted Alaska to be his big moment, a stage to show the world he was still in control, still commanding attention, still the man who could bend nations to his will. He pictured headlines declaring his strength, photo ops of cheering crowds, and a narrative he could sell to his supporters as proof that he hadn't lost his grip. But reality didn't play along. When Trump landed in Alaska, the turnout wasn't the sea of red hats he had imagined. The crowd was thin, the energy muted, and the enthusiasm far less than what his team promised. Even the staging felt off. Instead of looking like a powerful world leader rallying his people, he looked like a man desperately trying to recreate the glory days of 2016, but with half the spark and none of the momentum. The optics were brutal. Cameras caught Trump standing in front of a backdrop that looked more like a makeshift fairground than a presidential event. His speech stumbled from topic to topic, unfocused and scattered. At times, he rambled about his so-called victories, but even his supporters seemed restless, shifting in their seats, clapping out of obligation rather than excitement. For a man obsessed with image, this was a nightmare, and it wasn't just the weak crowd that made it humiliating. World leaders were watching too. Trump had just come from a series of meetings where he promised to show strength against adversaries and unity with allies. Instead, the Alaska stop turned into a display of weakness. His critics were quick to seize on the moment, saying it was less of a rally and more of a sad reminder that Trump's grip on power was slipping. What cut the deepest was the contrast. While Trump tried to portray himself as the alpha on the global stage, European leaders were openly mocking him behind closed doors. They knew the truth, that Trump wasn't feared anymore. He was tolerated, humored, even pitied. And Alaska didn't change that. It confirmed it. The most telling sign came not from Trump's words but from his body language. The man who once thrived on stage presence looked tired, deflated, almost uncertain. His signature bravado, the chest-out, chin-up swagger, was missing. Instead, he looked smaller, weighed down by the reality that the world wasn't buying his act anymore. And while Trump may have thought he could spin the Alaska trip as a triumph, the chants back in Washington told the real story. No matter how many speeches he gave or photo ops he staged, the people weren't buying it. They weren't chanting his name. They were chanting against him. But if Alaska was supposed to be a victory lap, what came next would be even worse. Because when Trump returned to U.S. soil, he wasn't met with celebration. He was met with outrage, anger, and resistance that was growing louder every single day. If Trump thought the Alaska trip was embarrassing, what came afterward was a full-blown disaster. Because his so-called allies, the very people he once bragged about controlling, started turning on him. And they didn't do it quietly. Behind the scenes, European leaders had already grown tired of Trump's antics. They were exhausted by the constant unpredictability, the empty promises, and the bizarre praise he showered on leaders like Putin while dismissing his own allies. But now, they began making their frustrations public. Some of the harshest criticism came not from enemies, but from the very partners America had relied on for decades. Reports surfaced of private meetings where leaders openly mocked Trump. They questioned his stability, his judgment, and whether he could even be trusted to keep America's commitments. One diplomat was quoted saying that dealing with Trump felt like babysitting a man who doesn't want to grow up. Another described him as dangerous, not because he's strong, but because he's weak and desperate. And it wasn't just whispers anymore. Entire governments were starting to shift away from him. France, Germany, and Canada began making moves to coordinate without Washington, preparing for the possibility that Trump couldn't be relied upon. For an American president, this was unheard of. The message was clear. Trump was no longer seen as the leader of the free world. Back home, the backlash from allies created another problem. Military officials who had long warned about Trump's erratic decision-making suddenly found themselves under pressure. If NATO allies didn't trust him, how could America's own generals? It was a dangerous place for any commander-in-chief to be. The humiliation was complete when leaks emerged about a private conversation between Trump and several European leaders. Instead of commanding respect, Trump was reportedly laughed at by heads of state who were supposed to stand shoulder to shoulder with him. For Trump, who lived off the illusion of dominance, this was devastating. But here's the thing. Trump wasn't just losing face abroad. The cracks were widening at home too, and the chants in Washington were only the beginning. Because the more his allies distanced themselves, the more the American people started questioning if Trump had lost control entirely. And that's when the chaos in Washington hit a boiling point. Back in Washington, things weren't any calmer. In fact, the situation inside the Capitol had turned into complete chaos. The chants of Free DC weren't just a one-night moment in a stadium. They spilled into the streets, into news coverage, and even into Congress itself. Suddenly, Trump's grip on the Capitol looked weaker than ever. Lawmakers who had once stayed quiet about Trump's behavior began speaking out. Some described his meeting with Putin as a national humiliation. Others warned that America was becoming isolated, abandoned by allies, and vulnerable to foreign influence, all under Trump's watch. The criticism wasn't just coming from Democrats either. Even Republicans who had long defended him were starting to crack, quietly admitting behind closed doors that Trump was becoming a liability. The tension inside the White House reached a boiling point. Staffers described an atmosphere of paranoia, with Trump lashing out at advisors, demanding loyalty tests, and raging about traitors leaking information. Instead of focusing on solutions, he was obsessed with silencing criticism and punishing anyone who dared question him. But the more he tried to clamp down, the worse things got. Protesters kept showing up outside the White House, journalists kept digging, and whispers of investigations into his administration's ties with foreign leaders began to spread. Each new headline added fuel to the fire, making Trump look less like a powerful president and more like a cornered man fighting to survive. And then came the most damaging blow of all. Reports suggesting that senior officials inside his own administration were secretly working to contain him. Imagine that. People he had appointed, people who owed their positions to him, quietly strategizing behind the scenes to limit his influence. For Trump, who thrived on control, this was the ultimate betrayal. The chants of Free DC now carried a deeper meaning. It wasn't just about resisting Trump from the outside. It was about insiders, allies, and even his own team realizing that his hold on power was slipping away. But while Trump was battling chaos in Washington, the real storm was brewing somewhere else entirely, in the American heartland. While Washington was boiling over, something even more dangerous for Trump was happening far from the Capitol. The anger had spread to the heartland, the very states that once formed the backbone of his support. In small towns and big cities alike, people began gathering in public squares, holding up signs, chanting the same words that first shook Audi Field. Free D.C. For many, it wasn't just about Washington anymore. It was about freeing the entire country from what they saw as Trump's iron grip. Farmers complained about being crushed under his trade wars. Factory workers accused him of making promises he never kept. And students who had grown up hearing about freedom and democracy were furious that the United States seemed to be bowing to Putin on the world stage. These weren't just political activists. These were everyday Americans who felt betrayed. The revolt gained fuel online. Hashtags calling out Trump's failures began trending, with videos of the stadium chants going viral. Millions shared clips of protesters shouting in unison, spreading the message like wildfire. What began as a local cry inside a sports arena had turned into a national movement that Trump couldn't control. Even conservative strongholds weren't immune. Town hall meetings grew heated, with lifelong Republican voters demanding answers from their representatives. Some openly said they regretted ever putting Trump in the White House. That kind of fracture was something no president, especially one like Trump who relied on loyalty above all else, could afford to ignore. The more people pushed back, the more desperate Trump became. Instead of calming the unrest, he doubled down with fiery speeches, branding anyone who opposed him as an enemy. But his words, once enough to rally crowds, now fell flat. The chants were louder, the protests bigger, and the sense of rebellion unstoppable. And just when it looked like things couldn't get worse for Trump, the cracks within his own administration began to widen, leading to a betrayal that no one saw coming.